Rita.
But Maayan, we had, I think, 1 in 3 Jews voting for Mamdani. And at the last presidential election, despite the fact that the Democrats seem to have an anti-Semitism problem, they have the Squad, they had even Kamala Harris declining to select the most qualified running mate in Governor Shapiro because of his background. We had the majority of the Jewish community voting for the Democrats. So talk to me about that, that shift perhaps that is happening, or that realisation that the Democrats have an issue with anti-Semitism, anti-Israeli sentiment, and how the electorate is digesting that information.
For sure. I mean, I think it is extremely concerning that you saw the number of Jews vote for Mamdani. That you did, but a large part of that is as your colleague mentioned, the younger generation. There's a real concern about the disconnect between diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews, and the fact that we're not communicating enough together. Israel also, you have to remember, for most Jews living in America, is not their #1 issue. And so some of the more socialist policies, the more liberal mentality still is very influential among the Jewish community in the United States. And it's very concerning. Of course, as you've seen in Australia and as we're seeing more and more in the United States, as anti-Semitism rises, there is a chance that more and more Jews will start to place this on the political echelon and begin to vote otherwise. While you mentioned, the presidential election, it is true that still the majority of Jews voted Democrat. There were fewer Jews that voted Democrat than in the past, and there were more Jews that voted Republican or voted for Donald Trump. So we did start to see a bit of a shift in the presidential election, not nearly as much as was expected. But as an American myself, even though I've lived in Israel for a number of years, 16 of the last 25, at the same time, I would say that when you're living in the United States, your #1 issue is, again, not Israel. And so Jews vote for where their heart is. And Jews tend to be more open-minded and more liberal. But again, if you live under anti-Semitism and you start to see more violent attacks, it's likely that that will start to shift more and more. But it's a slow shift.
Now, just on the media bias, the BBC has been found to have institutional bias when it comes to this issue. What's your verdict on our public broadcaster, the ABC, and also SBS, which is also taxpayer funded?
Look, I'm not going to judge any one media outlet. What I know of the ABC is certainly that it is not been reporting what I would call correctly or accurately about Israel. And my assumption is that, very similar to the BBC, there's some inherent bias that is going on there, perhaps influenced by other issues in your own country, the number of Muslim citizens, the take of the government, and the weak stance that it's had in support of Israel, its recognition of a Palestinian state when there is a terror entity on Israel's border, extremism. None of the criteria have been met. And yet, a country comes out in favor of having this terrorist state on a border of what has historically been one of your closest allies. So, I will share with you that I did go into the Kerem Shalom crossing on the Gaza side of the border with an ABC reporter not too long ago. We went to go see the vast amount, the tons of aid that was being brought into Gaza and not being able to be distributed because of issues with the United Nations distribution. This was in the time when there was such a lot of looting by Hamas. My report and his report were very, very different. And when I stood there on the Gaza side and heard the report, I was honestly quite surprised. Maybe I shouldn't say surprised because I expected as such, but the twisting and turning of the narrative to assume that with all this aid being let in to get to the people of Gaza by Israel through the crossing, and yet somehow it was Israel's fault that the aid was not arriving to the people.
Well, Maayan, I think that's a very diplomatic way of answering Rita's question, but you answered it absolutely spot on. I don't think any of us would have been surprised that the ABC's reporting was very different to yours or indeed reality. Maayan Hoffman, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. Great to chat to you.